Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Welcome to the Sine Institute Summer Series. We are joined today by former Congressman Will Hurd as he discusses his book, American Reboot.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sine community. We're so excited that you're joining us today. Thank you very much for doing this. I have been looking forward to this all summer. And I, yes, read American Reboot, an incredible book by former Congressman Will Hurd. He is also a cybersecurity executive and an officer in the clandestine service of the CIA. He's a native of San Antonio and a graduate of Texas A&M University. We are so excited to have you join us today in the heat of San Antonio. You look cool and collected, Congressman. So welcome to the Sine event today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Amy, thanks for having me. And please call me Will. I didn't like the term Congressman when I was in Congress, and I definitely don't need it when I'm out. So thanks for the invitation, and I appreciate all the different groups that were willing to co-host this.
Yes, absolutely. And I just, you're an excellent example of public service. So I'll try and get used to calling you Will, as I've worked on Capitol Hill and it's been a little hard for me, but we'll get to it. And as you mentioned, we did have so many groups that wanted to share in the event today. We had the School of Public Affairs here at American University. Our Alumni Association is co-sponsoring. And it's really great to have the American University College Republicans led by Austin Drake, who you were able to meet a little bit earlier, Will. And then also Courtney Britt, who's the national chairperson for the College Republicans National Committee. So we're so excited to have you join us today. I read the book, and I have to admit, I kind of really like being ED of the Sine Institute because it's making me read things that I might not have 10 years ago when I was in the crux of my career. But this is an incredible book for everybody. And I just really want to say, why did you write the book? What was the impetus to put this all down on paper?
Well, I wrote the book because we have to do something different, right? What's wild, today, 88% of the country thinks the country's on the wrong track. You know how crazy that number is. And that's not a Republican or a Democrat thing. And that number has been growing over the years. I think when I ran my first campaign back in 2010, it was low 50s, right? And so we've seen that number creep up, and there's an even scarier number out there that 55% of Democrats, and this is, I think, YouGov did a poll, I want to say it was with Politico, y'all can fact check me on that, but it said 55% of Democrats, 53% of Republicans, and 49% of independents believe that democracy is not going to exist in the short term. That's a crazy number, and that's a bipartisan outrage. And so for me, it was, we got to do something different. One of the things that I learned in my first career as an undercover officer in the CIA was get off the X. I tell that story. I lead off the book with that. It's a lesson I learned at the super secret CIA training facility, the Farm. And it's basically the X is a location where something's going down, and the last place you want to be when something's going down is where it's going down. We got to move. We got to do something different. And so the reason for writing the book was to say, hey, here's a different way we can do things. And it wasn't written directly for Republicans. It was written for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's great. It's the subtitle is An Idealist Guide to Getting Big Things Done. And I have to say, I've used Getting Off the X. I've borrowed it from you if you don't mind. With my niece recently, I was talking to her and it was like, you got to get off the X, because it was, she was confronting a problem like in the center of it. And I think that there's so many things you could have talked about in this book, but there's basically some 5 main, components. The Republican Party directly, the failure to present a principled vision for the future, in your words. There was this lack of honest leadership, specifically in Washington, D.C., income inequality. That was a big piece of it. The U.S. economic and military dominance, and how technology can change in the next 30 years will make, the advancements of the last 30 years look trivial, right? So this is the 5 main components of the book. You could have chosen from so many. Like, why did you pick these particular issues to tackle?
I picked these, right? The details of the book started with somebody. It's like, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said no, and then they said, well, what would it be about? And then I was like, it would probably be about the things that I try to talk about when I was in Congress that most people weren't talking about, right? And I think sometimes the way our system and our political system is designed, most of our elected officials are talking to a very small percentage of the population. And so let's get into some math real quick. And this as a part of the professional political class, right? Our primary system. So in 2020, 67% of voting eligible people voted in the general election, but only 23% voted in the primaries. That means 44% of voting eligible folks decided not to vote in the primary. Those are crazy numbers. And if we go back to the last non-presidential election in 2018, only on average 54,000 people voted in a contested primary for the House. Okay. Now, 2020, you only had 2020, you only had 34 House seats that were contested, in my opinion. And the way I define contested is split party. You had, where people voted for one party for president, the other party for the House. 34. Right now, there's only 16 of those. If you go back to if you go back to 2000, that number was 54, I believe, 56. If you go back to, it was 80. It was in the 80s. If you go back to 1980, the number was north of 150, right? And so what ultimately happens is when the majority of your House seats, and again, this goes all the way down to lower ballot, when they're decided by 54,000 people or less, that means 3% of the population is making the decision of who's going to Washington. And those are the only 3% people talk about, right? And so oftentimes, that's what drives many of the conversations when we should be thinking about these broader issues. And look, I've been lucky. Recruiting spies and stealing secrets for the CIA was the best job on the planet. It was super fun. I got to go to some wild places. I got to live and see some amazing things, right? And I got frustrated, and that's why I decided to run for Congress. But I also, when I lost my first race, got the chance to build a business, and now I'm in investment banking. I've seen the world from all these different perspectives. And guess what? Our success is no longer guaranteed. America staying the global superpower is no longer guaranteed. We probably have about a decade before we get surpassed by China. And everybody wants to say, oh, we're overestimating, just like we overestimated the Russians and we overestimated the Japanese. Well, guess what? Neither one of those countries, economies or population was bigger than ours. China is 4 times our size, which means if we want our economy to stay up, we're going to have to ultimately be 4 times as effective as them and efficient as them. And so it's a completely different race. And so that is the broader thing. Like, I want us to keep our role in the world because it benefited us. And if we don't get our political parties right, and guess what? I talk about the Republican Party because I'm a Republican. Right. And fixing the Republican Party is not only important for Republicans, it's important for Democrats, independents, and people don't vote, because we need a competition of ideas. I can be critical all day long about the Democratic Party, but guess what? They're not going to listen. Okay. And then national leadership, we need to make sure that we have our leaders that are inspiring, not fear mongering. And that is something that has creeped in for the last 20, 30 years. And so I pick those issues. And look, we have income inequality because we have education inequality. The fact that prior to the pandemic, most Americans couldn't handle an emergency expense of $400. That's crazy. That shouldn't be the case, right? And then technology is something near and dear to my heart. It's going to move. It's going to make us look. The last 40 years since the advent of the personal computer is going to look like we've been monkeys playing in the dirt with sticks compared to what we're going to see over the next 40 years. And so we got to be ready. And so that's, so those are all 5 issues that I've been intimately involved in and seeing. And then if we address this is going to allow America for another 250 years to continue to improve the quality of life for all Americans and uplift humanity.
Well, I have to say, when I read that first chapter and you outlined that, it seemed daunting. I mean, these are 5 really challenging issues to tackle. Any one of them could have been a whole entire book. But it's funny because, and I want to encourage people to ask questions whenever, because, I mean, this is a large, robust group. We can ask questions of Will at any time. But I think it's important to understand your perspective. You say you're a firm believer in pragmatic idealism. Isn't that difficult with these 5 issues? Like, and what is pragmatic idealism?
You know, it's funny that I can't tell you how much debate there was around those 2 words. Yeah. And what's wild is if I go back to college, right? And is when the notion of pragmatic idealism, I've journaled off and on my entire life. And I have some from back when I was a freshman and sophomore about if I were to write a book, what would the title of the book be? Right. And it was going to be pragmatic idealism. And it starts with, yes, these are daunting challenges, right? But it starts with my dad. My dad's black and my mom's white. They met in LA in the late 60s, moved to South Texas in 1971. It wasn't in vogue to be an interracial couple in South Texas in 1971. That's why, like, all this debate right now about gay marriage and interracial marriage is like, this shouldn't be hard. This shouldn't be hard. And some of the debates that we're seeing now are mimicking some of the debates that we had when my parents, it was only 4 years after the court case, Loving case, where my parents were able to get married, right? Which is just wild, wild to me. My dad always said, have a PMA, a positive mental attitude. And he would tell us that throughout his entire life. And look, my dad when he was, a traveling salesman, he would get called the N-word and kicked out of stores, but he still had to do his job, right? Like, he couldn't stay in any place he wanted to stop at. My parents live in the home that they live in now because it was the only neighborhood at the time that would sell to an interracial couple, right? And so if my dad can have a PMA going through those things, if my mom could have a PMA going through those things, I can too. And so it starts with that. And to me, the phrase pragmatic idealism means idealism is about doing the most you can for the greatest number of people possible. That's the idealism piece. The pragmatic piece is recognizing and accepting where you are right now, right? In order to move from where you are to where you want to go. And I learned a long time ago, vision, process, structure. If you don't have a vision of where you're trying to go to or what you're trying to do, you're not going to be able to get there. So we have to articulate that and then put a process and structure in place in order to get there. And so when I think of pragmatic idealism, it's a realism about where we are today, but it's hopeful that where we can go. And guess what? The thing that I learned representing a 50-50 district, I don't care if I was in deep blue areas or ruby red areas, people want to believe in something larger than themselves. People want to worry and focus on putting food on the table, a roof over their head, and making sure the people they love are healthy and happy. And when we address those things, we're going to be better off. We have gotten into this notion that We want to fear monger and scare people. And yeah, it works. It works on social media. If I was more of an a-hole on social media, my social media footprint would be 10x of what it is now, right? But guess what? You got to model the behavior you want to see. Anyways, I'm getting off topic here, Amy. But
No, but I think your background is important. You know, our experiences really influence the direction that, you know, we go in. And so it's interesting to me because some of those, you know, experiences, some of the things that you said you value, you know, I did spend a lot of time in the book going like, come on, aren't you a Democrat? Like, that's Democratic. Oh, that's Republican. Like, and so to you, like, what made you decide that you wanted to run under the Republican ticket? And like, what do you think are the core principles of
Sure. So let me start with, I think 80% of the country is in the middle, right?
Yeah.
And so this is why, you know, this notion that there's an exclusive red and exclusive blue on the edges, it is. But
Yeah.
but here's, in my opinion, what's crazy is the political continuum is no longer a line.
Right.
It's a horseshoe, which means the lunatic fringe are closer to each other than they are to the middle. They oftentimes are advocating for the same outcome, but for the diametrically opposite reasons, right? And so for me, when I think, look, was I reciting the Constitution when I was in 4th grade? No, I wasn't. Okay, like I didn't even know. Like it's funny. My experience in the CIA, it was wild when I sent my email to my buddies, been like, hey, I'm running for Congress, and they're like, wait a minute, you're a Republican? And I was like, wait, you're not? You know, we didn't know, right? And so it starts with my dad. My dad always says he was a Republican since Lincoln freed us, all right? And my dad grew up in East Texas, a place called Marshall. Marshall is important because it was probably the second most important city in the Confederacy during the Civil War. When Jefferson Davis thought, you know, hey, they're coming for me, they were thinking about moving the Confederacy from Richmond to Marshall, Texas. And so that's why during Reconstruction, a lot of Republicans fled or moved and went into Marshall. So my dad and his family, my dad's people were exposed to Republicans during Reconstruction. Right now, Marshall is also the place where the first white primaries happened, and really, some would say, started Jim Crow in Texas. But it starts with my dad's influence. But when I was in university, I was at Texas A&M University. I was there the year that the Bush School got started there, the George H.W. Bush School. Right. And I got the chance, because I was a student leader, my last year in school, I was student body president. I had a lot of interactions with President Bush. He was a great guy. Barbara Bush was awesome. And then I also got to know George W. Bush when he was governor. I knew Rick Perry when he was ag commissioner. He was an Aggie. And so, like, when I look, and by the way, a dude named Bob Gates, right? Dr. Gates was the interim head of the Bush School before he became president of Texas A&M. And when I decided to go into the CIA, it was because there was a guest lecturer at a class I was taking. He was one, they were like, hey, you need to talk to Bobby Gates, right? And this was before he became Secretary of Defense. And so those were people that were super influential in my life. And then when you look at the time in the CIA, a robust and the importance of foreign policy became very clear to me. My parents had started a business, and the idea of moving up the economic ladder, right? Like, all of those experiences influenced me. Oh, and by the way, and I can't say those are uniquely Republican things, because other folks that don't necessarily identify with the Republican Party believe in those principles and theories.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me because I think campaigning is different than governing. And a lot of times campaigns are seen about differences and contrasts, whereas governing has to be about consensus. So I'm very interested, how did you tackle certainly campaigning in Texas 23, where it couldn't just be about contrast and this, in order to win in that district, you really had to build a consensus during the campaign. So how did you go about doing that?
So it started with another major problem that we're seeing in the country, and why 88% of Americans in the country is on the wrong track. There's an erosion in trust in all of our institutions.
Yes.
Starts with our federal government, includes our state government, local government, includes academia, it includes the media, and like everybody's included. The only group that still have positive net favorables are businesses in the business community. And ultimately, it's because guess what? They got to deliver a good or a service at a particular time, and it's got to work a certain way. Or guess what? They're out of business, right? And so this erosion of trust starts when in campaigns you say one thing, and then you can't deliver when you get to office. So I had a real simple rule. I didn't talk about things. I wasn't gonna be like, I'm gonna do this, right? If I couldn't pull it off. I could say, I believe in doing this. I believe this is something we need to go, but I wasn't one being like, this is going to happen. And so when I won because of my value proposition that, hey, you're gonna see me. One of the problems that people had in my district, because it's so big, 29 counties, 2 time zones, 825 miles of the border between Texas and Mexico. It took 10 and a half hours to drive across the district at 80 miles an hour, which was the speed limit in most of the district. It was larger than 27 states, I believe, roughly the size of the state of Georgia. And so one of the things that voters say is like, they never saw their member, the previous Republican nor the previous Democrat. And I said, listen, you're going to see me. And I proved it during the campaign. But I said, you're not always going to agree with me, but you're going to know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And that was the value proposition for the first race. So for the second race, I had to prove I was going to do the things I did. So I kept stats of how many town halls I did, how many events I did in the district. I said, listen, the guy that I beat in 6 years, he got 0 bills. One bill signed the law, right? And it's just like, and I got, my total tally when I was done was 21 or 23. Signing in 6 years, which is a lot. So for me, and this is a long-winded answer to your question, the point was, you can't promise things that aren't going to get done.
Right.
And that's part of the issue that we're having, because you're right. It's all about creating contrast, because that changes people's opinions. But also you need to say, what are you for? And that's how I was able to. It's hard. Right? It's hard. But I think it was worthwhile. And that's why I continue to win when nobody expected me to.
Well, I think also I've got a good stat. By the end of your first term, you had 7 bills and 2 amendments signed into law. And you mentioned in the book that you never even started those endeavors unless they were bipartisan. So obviously that work in the first, your first term had a big impact.
Well, I think 10,000 bills got introduced last Congress, and 300 got signed into law, right? So a lot of people are doing things that know is not going anywhere, but they want to get on TV and beat their chests. And this is both. This is Republicans and Democrats, right? And that's what people get frustrated. It's like, do something. When there's a problem, do something. And also it comes back to my ethos from being, in the CIA. We never got to say, sorry, Mr. President, we can't go out and do that, because we don't have enough people or we don't have enough money. That was never our answer. The answer was, yes, sir, we're on it, right? And so you have this can-do attitude. And then I also did try to work on some of these most important issues, things like immigration, right? Which is still frustrating, right? 2 votes away from pulling something off to help DACA kids, right? So there was plenty of frustrations, but when you focus on solving problems for real people, and get a posse together to pull it off, then you can get things done.
Here's the other thing that I loved from the book. In fact, I pulled it right out and wrote it down on a sticky note and put it right on my desk. And it's from a mutual friend of ours, Stony Burke, who you mentioned in the book, who I know as well. And he certainly helped us get you here today. But I just thought it was so smart when he said, people need to ensure the audio and the video match. So share a little bit about that conversation and what you took from and why that's important.
Well, when he says that, I always think about those, I love old school Kung Fu movies, right? Where the action's happening and someone's talking and their lips don't match up with what they're saying, right? And it's super weird. But the idea is what you say needs to match up with what you do. Yeah. And oftentimes that doesn't happen. Another way to describe it is ideological consistency. And there's a lack of ideological consistency. And guess what? You should believe the same thing, whether you're in power or not. And I find it funny now. Look, I remember when I first got into Congress. This was President Obama was president at the time. Republicans were in power. John Boehner was the speaker, and all the guys from the Freedom Caucus would be talking about, we need to exercise our Article 1 authorities, right? Basically saying Article 1 of the Constitution, it gives the powers to the legislative branch. The legislative branch was ultimately supposed to be the most powerful branch. And they're saying that, legislative branch needs to exercise authority. But when President Trump came into power, no one was talking about Article 1 authorities. It was like, hey, let's be a rubber stamp. It's like, wait a minute. Like, if we're supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, let's act that way, right? And one example for me is of how I showed ideological consistency. I'm supportive of giving a legal pathway to dreamers, to folks that are in the DACA program, right? But it shouldn't be done through executive order. And so a lot of people were shocked when I opposed President Obama's executive order on DACA, but I also opposed President Trump's executive order on DACA. Now, they were both trying to do the exact opposite thing, but what dreamers don't need is this uncertainty from administration to administration going back and forth. Congress ultimately needs to act. And look, I had people do a die-in in my office where I think I tell that the story in the book, where I was like, what the heck? I'm like, working on the bill to solve this problem, right? But for me, it was important to be ideologically consistent to make sure that my audio and the video matches. And when you do that, you sleep well at night. Like, I sleep like a baby. There's not one vote that I'm disappointed in or I would change or take back, because I always started with what are my values and how does that reflect in what I do.
Well, that's a perfect lead up. We did get a question coming in. I encourage you, please ask questions. I could talk to you for hours, Will, but we want to make sure that some of the students are getting a chance to. Tyler asked a question along these lines. He said, is there a vote you did in the House that went against the House Republican Party establishment? And what made you vote that way? You did. And you
was there one?
By the vote. Yeah.
Yeah, hell, there was a lot, Tyler. Like, what, like it was I was often, well, look, let's take one that's on top of everybody's minds.
Right.
Gun violence.
Mm-hmm.
Uvalde was a community I represented for 6 years. So I spent a lot of time in Uvalde, and my heart aches like everybody else for those 22 families that instead of planning a trip to SeaWorld or Fiesta, Texas or Disneyland, they had to plan a funeral. And look, I got an A rating from the NRA. The NRA supported my reelection campaigns, but I also met with groups like Moms Demand Actions in every town. And I was one of 8 Republicans that voted for a bill. It's always generally referred to as HR 8. This was the background check bill, right? It was one of 8 Republicans. And I took a lot of grief for it. But in the end, right, if you believe in the plain language of the Second Amendment, you shouldn't be afraid. Like, that bill was not taking guns out of anybody's hands, despite that's what everybody was saying about it. And so don't be afraid of the rhetoric around that stuff. So another one is like the Equality Act. It's like, guess what? Don't discriminate. It's not hard, right? Like I'm sorry. I've lived in a lot of places that different religions, right? I am a Christian, but I've lived in Hindu countries and Muslim countries. I've spent a lot of time in Israel. I do a lot with the Jewish community. No religion says it's okay to discriminate, right? Like, don't discriminate. It shouldn't be hard. And so there were some of those kinds of bills that I voted for. But guess what? Here's what you do. You explain to people why you did it and what you're doing. And guess what? I continue to get reelected. And for some of those folks that didn't like it, guess what? They didn't vote for me in the first place.
Well, I appreciate you also bringing up Uvalde. We were going to certainly ask you. I know it's probably challenging, even though you're out of Osivus. I know you feel a connection to that community in so many ways, because so much of what you do as a member of Congress too. We talk about the legislation, but the community, and constituent services is a huge part of it, and just
It's the best
hearing
part.
from people what they need, right? So I mean,
Look, it's the best part. Like to me, the parts that I'm going to miss and the stories I remember is when you're helping someone, right? Like, I try to share some of those stories in the book. One that I did literally my last day. It was a guy in South Texas who's a tick rider. Okay, a tick rider is a dude that rides a horse looking for cows coming across the border that have the fever tick. The fever tick is if you have it, you got to quarantine, huge, thousands of acres of land. It has a huge impact on our food supply. So this dude was riding around on his horse. Something happens, he falls off. Had to be medevaced to a military base. Okay. Make a long story short, the government denied him workman's comp. Because of that, the government then started garnishing his wages. And my man wasn't making that much money, right?
Sure.
And so this went on. He was about to lose his house, right? He came to us. It was difficult. Literally, we solved it on my last day. And I was just like, all right, y'all, turn off the lights, right? We're done. And it's interesting. Most people don't ever have a problem where they'd be like, I got to call my member of Congress. But a lot of people do in solving those things. But then also, how do you address some of these things that could happen in Uvalde? We know how a person becomes a mass murderer. We know that process. We know the metamorphosis of this. And so we got to address every step along the way. And so anybody who thinks that hearts and prayers, thoughts and prayers are enough, or they can't do anything because of the filibuster, I'm sorry, you're not doing your job, and maybe it's time to find another job. But we can address some of these what seem to be intractable problems if we start with, look, way more unites us than divides us.
Yeah. And
if we start with that thing that we're trying to achieve, and guess what? Everybody agrees. 50% of our teenagers should not be afraid to go to school because they're afraid of getting shot. Nobody thinks that's okay. If we start with that, then we can build upon the success that John Cornyn and Chris Murphy did a couple of weeks ago.
Well, it's interesting you bring up, that there's way more that unite us than divide us. You knew I was going to ask. I'm sorry, I was riveted when it happened. The bipartisan road trip town hall. You and Beto O'Rourke driving across to get back to votes. I mean, what was the impetus of that? And is that what happened? Were you discussing legislation? Were you just discussing, issues? And for some of us, some of the people who didn't share during, what did you get out of that?
So what had happened was, so Beto represented the city of El Paso. Mm-hmm. I represented parts of so you have the city of El Paso, you have the county of El Paso. And so our districts butted against each other. We worked on a lot of veterans issues together, cross-border trade initiatives together. So Beto and I were friends and worked together. I had a lot of veteran service organizations in San Antonio that wanted to talk to somebody on the committee. Beto was the only Republican on the committee. Excuse me. Beto was the only Texan on the committee. Beto's a Democrat. Beto was the only Texan on the committee, so I asked him to come to San Antonio, and he did. And so we had several meetings with veterans groups, and the first one, his flight gets. We were supposed to go back to DC that next day because we had votes, and his flight got canceled. And then my flight got canceled. I'm a Southwest Airlines guy, right? So if Southwest Airlines is canceling a flight, it's serious because they fly on anything, right? And so Beto goes, why don't we drive back and live stream it? And I agreed. After the fact, I learned he didn't think I was going to say yes. So the next day we rented a Chevy Impala and drove. It was a 35-hour trip, 31 hours in the car, or 29 hours live streamed. And talked about every issue imaginable. This was in the middle of the repeal and the replace of the Affordable Care Act debates. And what was fascinating is when we started on Beto's socials, and the negativity. There's only like 3 times when we stopped the tape. The first time we did it, I did it early on, and we were about like 75 minutes in, and I'm like, Beto, man, if this continues, like these people are so nasty and so rude. I'm not gonna be able to put up with this, all right? And he's like, let's give it a little bit of time. And honestly, at the 90-minute mark, people were positive. They're like, this is amazing what y'all are doing. Guess what? The next day when we were on my socials, Beto pauses it and was like, man, people are being nasty. But after 90 minutes, it changed. And what it proved to me is something I saw in the district, that the voters, Americans, want to see us disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah.
And it confirms that way more unites us than divides us, right? We had 29 million people watch over that 29 hours. And we were on every news program.
Everyone.
And people were shocked because 2 dudes were driving in a car. And what's disappointing is that then we went on to probably one of the more contentious and partisan elections, and they've only gotten worse. But I still go back to the majority of Americans are not that way, and they don't consume politics like it's sports. They're not on Twitter all day long, and they don't watch cable news. And so when we talk to folks, and get outside of those bubbles, we see a difference.
Well, let me go to another question because I think it's really timely in what we're talking about. Paul asks, today's challenges are so daunting and complex and structural that it has become a disincentive to citizen, participation in government. How do you inspire a new generation of leaders to do what you did, run and win and part of the solution and have conversations with the opposition party and, try to find success and pass those 7 bills in your first run? How do we do that?
So my first year in Congress, I got invited to speak at South by Southwest. This is the media, movie, music conference in Austin, Texas. And I was asked to participate on a panel with a bunch of YouTube stars. Mm-hmm. And the 4 of them combined had 500 million YouTube subscribers. I had 50, right? And 7 are probably on this call right now, right? And one of them was the digital director for The Rock, Dwayne Johnson.
Yeah.
And this is when the movie Moana was coming out. And she said, if Moana fails at the box office, are we going to blame the consumers, the moviegoers, or are we going to blame the product, the movie, right? And she answered the question herself and said what we were all thinking. Of course, we're going to blame the moviegoers and say Moana was a crummy movie if it fails at the box office. No, I am not saying Moana was a crummy movie. I thought it was quite delightful movie and had a lot of success at the box office. But she said, but it's only in politics that we do the opposite, where we blame the consumer, the voter, for not voting, instead of blaming the product, the politicians. Now, I believe because of the number of people that don't participate in the primary process. Now, if I had a magic wand, which I don't, but if I had a magic wand, what I would do is no district, except for our statewide district, no district could be more than +6 in either direction. So you would not have a district more than 56% Democrat or 56% Republican. A +6 seat, as you know me, Amy, is a jump ball. Anybody can win that. And so to me, the most important principle is driving competition in November. Now, I don't have a magic wand. You're not going to see national legislation on this. It's going to have to be every state to do something. But what can we all do? We can run and get more people to vote in the primaries. Yeah. And that's how I won. Nobody thought I was going to win, right? When I ran in 2014, Ted Cruz had endorsed my opponent. He was at the height of his powers in Texas. The establishment endorsed my opponent. The NRCC, the National Republican Congressional Committee, behind the scenes was supporting my opponent, right? The Tea Party was still a thing. They were supporting my opponent, but guess what? I still won. I won because I brought in new people into the election that had never voted before and or had not voted in primaries. And to do that, it only takes a handful of people. And so yes, the disincentives may exist because we don't like the options in November. But guess what? We don't have to accept that the only option we have in 2024 is 2 octogenarians. We don't have to accept that. But if you don't want that, that means we're going to have to get involved in primaries where those choices are decided. And oftentimes, there is somebody in that primary race who is not a crazy person, but they may not have talent like yours, Amy. They may not have the ability to raise money the way I was able to do when I ran. And so not only does it require candidates to run, it's going to require a professional political class to not try to do a cookie cutter campaign, from one race to another. And it's also going to require people that vote in general elections to take that additional step and vote in primaries. So look, things are getting crazier.
Yeah.
I forget who asked the question, but things are getting crazier. But I think our best days are ahead of us because they have to be. And I also think the best days are ahead of us because there are folks like people on this call that are saying, hey, we can't accept the way things are now.
Yeah, it's interesting because you really got to the heart of one of our questions, which was how do you get the 80% in the middle or some of them to turn out and vote in the primaries? As an operative, as somebody who worked with on the Democratic Party side, we saw the peer-to-peer conversations are what has to happen. I think in a lot of respect, to get that 80% means people have to talk to other people about how important it is and share that, information, as well. And I think anybody on this call and a lot of the students on this call talking to their peers and saying voting is an important part of this process that we should do, that can really, stimulate and get more participation.
Look, and you know how this works, right? This is, you have a general consultant. That general consultant is running 6-7 races across the country. They want to be able to do almost the same mail piece, the same TV ad. And when you target 4 voters, and for those on the call, 4 voters, somebody who has voted in 4 of the last 4 primaries. So 4 of the last 4 Republican, 4 of the last 4 Democratic primary. Those are like super reliable voters, and you're going to talk to them. And oftentimes, you know what the message is that resonates with them, and you stick with that. And your first, $100,000 goes towards talking to those people because they're the ones most likely to come out to vote.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Now, that also includes some of the craziest people that are going to vote as well too. And that's how the extremes get a disproportionate influence in our system, even though they make up a minority of our population. And so it's going to require candidates, professional political class, to talk to new voters. And we know who those people are. But guess what? They're not easy. They have different hopes, dreams, reasons for not voting, reasons to vote, right? And so it's the cost of acquisition for that voter. It's probably 2 or 3x what it is for a normal traditional Republican primary vote, not just Republican primary vote, any primary voter. And that's how the system continues to operate and produce products that the majority of the country doesn't like when it comes November.
Well, I think it's interesting too. One of the questions brought this up. That's something I'm passionate about. There's also these systemic issues. You mentioned it. Income inequality has a lot to do with education. I think our lack sometimes in faith in institutions. What about civic education in this country? Like, when are we learning about the process and bringing in another generation to show how important this is? And it's a representative democracy. It is their government. This lack in democracy you talked about before was concerning. But, what do we need to do to also counteract voter apathy and civic engagement?
Look, it starts with people that are involved in the process explaining why it matters, right? That's why I'm glad there's groups like the Sine Institute that are doing this and trying to educate people and get folks on why this stuff matters, to be able to talk about things in a dispassionate way, but where you can argue and have that competition of ideas to come to some kind of solutions. But there is a different feeling right now. I think the last 7 months, there is a different feeling in the country where the country is getting to a point where it's like, enough is enough. And folks that have kind of been like, I'm not paying attention to this because maybe, hey, life is good and I don't care, or there's nothing that I can do that's going to have an impact. those folks are starting to be like, hey, something needs to be done, right? And people are locking in. And so to me, the opportunity is the person that taps into that, right? And does things a little bit differently. And here's what I've learned, in my time being in politics. Nobody wants to be first.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be second, but people will fight to be third and fourth, right? And so when somebody breaks through and does things and wins races a little bit differently, you're going to start seeing that being mimicked.
Well, it's interesting as well. A lot of what we've been talking about is domestic issues, and that's certainly, I'm sure, a lot of what you talked about as you were crossing through Texas 23. But so a large majority of the book, and certainly your experience, in the CIA, is about how it's a global society. We're all interconnected. And so the issues that you mentioned about economic and military dominance and this technological sea change, this is not something that we can say stops at our borders, or, we're so dependent on what's happening in the world. So what do you think about the global perspective?
Sure.
and what we should, know about and care about as things are evolving?
Sure. I wrote a blog a couple of maybe 2 weeks ago about this topic, and the idea that we shouldn't have entangling alliances, that may have made sense 240 years ago, when the entire population of America could fit in LA. It doesn't make sense now in this interconnected world. And we look, I've always said the US became a superpower when we gave a helping hand to Europe after World War II.
Right.
That's when we started acting like a superpower. We actually became a superpower in the middle of World War I, when our economy surpassed the British economy in global GDP. And guess what? The UK was the most important power. It had the majority of the global GDP. Now it has 3.3%. That could happen to us.
Yeah.
And that's going to impact, and the world is not flat. What happened? Why was rebuilding Europe a good thing? Rebuilding Europe was a good thing because it helped us create a trading partner that together we created half of global GDP, right? Like, why should we be engaging with Mexico and Canada? Because our three countries build things together, and since NAFTA, our economies have increased 400%. Look, NATO has been the most successful alliance, and part of it was because to stop Russia from trying to destabilize our partnership. The fact that I think it was 19 or 18 of my former colleagues voted against expanding NATO and with Sweden and Finland, this is crazy to me, right? That's like a pro-Putin vote, which is crazy. So we have to engage in the rest of the world. And what has happened is this isolationism is not a Republican or a Democrat thing. It's in both parties. And our role in the rest of the world matters at home. Foreign policy is not foreign. And I think people are realizing with Ukraine that, whoa, something that's happened in Ukraine, a place that most people probably couldn't figure out on a map, that is impacting the price of food and the price of gas. It realized that, hey, we're a lot closer. And so the fact that after World War II, our military and economic dominance was guaranteed. It's no longer guaranteed. A group did a report, a bipartisan group of generals, diplomats, academics, did a report back in 2018 that said, hey, the Chinese government can surpass us. Oh, and by the way, that's what they're trying to do. This is not my opinion. This is what the Chinese government has said about themselves in English. They are trying to surpass the United States of America as a global superpower, and they're going to do that by being the global leader in a handful of advanced technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic space, bioengineering, biosynthetics, things like that. And so this is no longer about us in America becoming our best selves. We're in a competition with someone who's 4 times larger than us and whose economy is probably going to be the same size as ours, right? This is a debate. And so all of this stuff is connected. And if we can't get our own house in order, where we can have some debates about what should the proper part of American GDP should go towards healthcare? How much should we be spending on defense spending? What should the future of defense be? If we can't have these debates and come to some kind of conclusion, then we're not going to be able to deal in this global environment with someone who is going and engaging with our allies. The fact that most of the Middle East, all of Latin America, and most of Asia has not joined us in Europe in these sanctions against Vladimir Putin, not because they're afraid of Vladimir Putin, it's because they're afraid of the Chinese. That should be an indication to us that we need, and one of my line is, our friends should love us and our enemies should fear us. And that should be the fundamental background of our foreign policy.
Well, let me ask you this, because things are interconnected. People should have a global perspective. And we saw when the conflict in Ukraine started that news media was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week talking about this, showing what was happening. And then you hear less and less, as things go on. What is the role of media in educating citizens, trying to, and how has that changed and evolved? How did you even, build a relationship with the media when you were serving in Congress?
Look, for me, the way I built it was, listen, if I can't handle tough questions, then I'm pretty crummy at my job, right? So don't be afraid of talking about what you're working on, right? And so that was point one. But look, this is also part of the media's responsibility to rebuild that trust with the people that they're serving. And they have as much of a role to play. Look, their role is super important, because we can't look, democracy is fragile. It always has been fragile. It always will be fragile. This is something that, and the only way it works is if we have an educated electorate and we have a free press that is able to shine a light not only on what is happening within areas of power and halls of power, but also is trusted by the populace, right? And so look, some of them lost their ways because they were chasing clicks, because they were chasing that sensational thing. Now they're also playing into our own biases, right? We all have heard the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
That's been a thing since like the 1800s, okay? And so there's something about us as humans that we're attracted or we run to that thing that's sensational. So the media plays a role in it. Those that are involved in this, we have to continue to articulate the case of why these things matter. It's hard, right? And it's also hard in an environment. And there's this debate about, is the American public losing their attention span? I don't think they're losing the attention span. There's just a lot of fight for that attention. You can't have social media growing and podcasts growing at the same time where people are consuming longer form information. And I think what's happening now is, instead of having these dominant networks, you're having these micro influencers, if you will. I think that's a crummy phrase, where they're probably influencing a couple of 100,000 people at a time. And there's a lot of those things, rather than just the 3 networks or 5 channels, news channels that we watch on cable news.
Okay, I knew this was going to happen. You're obviously quite passionate about the issues that you ran on. You weren't able to accomplish everything you wanted to in Congress. So Aiden wants to know, in your future, are you running again in Texas or federally, or do you see yourself running again for office?
Look, I'm 44 years old, I'll be 45 next month. Yeah, August, next month. My political career is probably not over. I've been fortunate to serve my country, first in the CIA and then again in Congress. And if I have the opportunity to serve, I'll explore it, right? And I think it's important, you shouldn't think beyond the current election cycle, because the environment is very different.
Changes, yeah.
And so I'm not on a ballot in 22, but if there's opportunities for me to serve and the environment's right, then I'll evaluate it, right? And so, because again, I think if you have an idea and ability to influence change, you should try it, whether you're successful or not. And so, so I'll evaluate that when the time comes. So Aiden, I hope that's an endorsement of you asking the question, and you may get the first phone call.
Well, one of the other things that, I think is certainly interesting is, we talk to our students a lot here, our speakers that come in talk a lot. There's so many different facets to public service as well. I think sometimes we immediately think running for office is the answer to public service, but there's people who work in the civil service. There's people who go and work in the CIA. Like, what is your definition of public service? And for people who are thinking about that on this call, what do you think it means and why is it important?
Look, public service is about contributing to your community, right? And that community could be locally, right? That community could be in your city, your state, or your country. And so there's so many options, right? Like the diplomatic corps is amazing, as you said. For all the young women on this call, in addition to recruiting spies and stealing secrets, I managed people that recruited spies and stole secrets, and my best officers were women. You always hear about James Bond, right? But Nancy Bond is way cooler and way more interesting. So I just put that out there for all you young women that may not have thought about a career in intelligence, but it's something where you can be successful. So have an impact, right? Look, this, and it's your public service means contributing to this experiment we call America, right? Why was it called an experiment? It was called an experiment because when we started, nobody thought it was going to work. It had been 1,800 years before there was a democracy, the last democracy, and that was Rome. And Julius Caesar screwed that up when he became emperor, right? So nobody thought it was going to work. It was another 60 years before another country tried democracy, Switzerland. There's only 14 countries that have been in democracy for more than 100 years, right? We think most of us have only ever known democracy. So we think this is the only thing that can exist. We think that America's role should be less, not more. No, we have contributed to the uplifting of humanity. And if we're to continue that, we need more people that are willing to participate in this little experiment. And there's so many ways to do that. And I'm glad there's folks that are interested in it.
Yeah, and I'm certainly glad that you are an example of that in real time, and at this stage say that you're looking for other ways to serve, and there is so many dynamic ways to do that. I will say it's been a challenging time, even when I talk to the heads of the Democrats and the Republicans on campus and others, things like January 6th and questioning of democracy and the integrity of our elections, things like that. These are things that as a nation we're struggling with, and certainly you see from your position, and yet I guess the last question would be, you proclaim yourself an idealist. So what are you hopeful about, and what do you see about all of us? And maybe you saw it a lot in that car ride to DC, but how can we do this? How can we come together and solve some of our greatest challenges?
But I think what makes me hopeful is things. Look, President Trump the election was not stolen from him. It was lost. He lost the House, he lost the Senate, and he lost the White House. What happened on January 6th was an insurrection. And what we have seen now with the January 6th committee showing what is going on in an inside view, and people are learning more, it's having an impact on the country in a positive way, right? And so for something that was a dark time, the fact that the folks on that committee stuck to it and continued to illuminate things. I stay positive because, look, I see young entrepreneurs that are doing things in AI and bioengineering. We can program DNA like we program computer code. What? Like, it's crazy. We're going to have algorithms that are smarter than most people on a certain thing, which is going to lead to better health outcomes and people living longer and healthier lives, right? Like, there's so many exciting things that are happening. And I see people and young folks, look at what Snapchat did on registering people to get people to get involved, to run for office at all levels, right? It was millions of people. And so it's easy to focus on those negative things that keep getting repeated, but it's harder to find those people that are doing amazing things. And guess what? We need to model the behavior we want to see. If we want to see people that are being more positive and talking about real issues, are we liking them on social media? Are we sharing them on social media? Are we following them? Are we telling our friends about them? Those are things that we can do. And by the way, y'all can follow me on at Will Hurd, HURD, and get on my website too, willbehurd.com. But these are things that are within our power to do. And so I choose to believe in our best selves. And guess what? I know there's people that are out there working, and I'm gonna do everything I can to achieve that vision of where I think we should go.
Well, it's been an honor to spend time with you. I have to say, like, in a great way, this might not have been a book that I would have thought to pick up, because I think sometimes we see things in red and blue. And it was one of the best books I certainly read this year. I learned a lot. And I think what it should instill all of us to do is go find somebody who might be from a different idea, or maybe you think that, oh, they are from a different party, and just have a conversation. You know, conversations don't have to necessarily change our mind. They should just inform us about all the things that, you know, are out there.
And Amy, I just want to thank you for saying that, right? Because a lot of your friends would look down their nose at you for saying that, because why would you read a Republican's book? And so the fact that your audio and your video is matching right?
Today.
It matters. And the more people see this, and the more people can see, look, the organizations that you've participated in have spent a lot of money to try to defeat me, right? But guess what? There's a lot where we can agree on, and to try to improve the country, because I believe you want to make this country and continue to make this country the greatest place to live. And so if we show that, then other people can see that and mimic the behavior. So thank you for what y'all are doing at the Institute.
I learned a lot from your example, and we have a bunch of the books for students that register. We're going to get a copy of the book to you. We're going to share that with our community. On behalf of all of our co-sponsors, and especially on behalf of President Burwell and American University, you are welcome on campus anytime. The next time you're in DC, we'd love to see you. We're going to stay in touch. We're going to share with our community also ways to follow you and learn more. And I look forward to meeting you someday in person. And I'm going to take this book and share it with somebody who I think probably wouldn't have normally read it, and encourage them to do so. So
awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you so much, Will.
Bye-bye. See y'all.
Take care.